Hey everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Raids podcast, where we get under the hood of founder scaling stories. Ben and I are lucky enough to be here with Justin Hughes, chairman and co-founder of NetZeroNitrogen. Welcome to the podcast, Justin.
Thank you.
Good to have you. So a big part of this episode theme is going to be based around sort of hard founder decisions, sort of for, knowing when it might be the right way to step away from CEO, as an example, which has obviously recently occurred with you, Justin. So we'll definitely get into that. But as a bit of a starter, tell us a little bit more about the problem that, NetZeroNitrogen is trying to solve, and why did you choose to build in this space?
So the problem is quite easily described, to be honest. It's all around synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So if you're not familiar with the dynamics of fertilizer, it's basically essential for food security, feeds directly or indirectly about half the world's population, but it's polluting, and way more polluting than people realize. It only has about 30 to 50% efficacy, and the rest that doesn't get used by the plant, the nitrogen, it goes into the water course as nitrate pollution and or finally into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which broadly makes CO2 look like a bit of a health fad. I think fertilizer is a little bit like tobacco or alcohol. If it was invented today, it would probably get banned, but we are absolutely reliant on it, so you can't ban it. And so if somebody came up with an alternative, that would be a good thing. So that's the thing that NetZeroNitrogen does. It's interesting when you say about how did I come up with that idea. It sounds very grand being chairman and co-founder. It wasn't my idea. Like a lot of things in science, we're standing on the shoulders of others who've done lots of work before in this field around could you replace fertilizer with a biological. So fertilizer is a chemical, which means that it's got a long shelf life. It's not alive in the sense that a biological, and however, it's as I said, it's polluting. But could you replace it with a biological? Because if you could do that, it might be a lot cleaner and better for everybody. And so NetZeroNitrogen's mission is to eliminate the billion-ton contribution of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers to greenhouse gases every year. The way I got into this is I've got almost no relevant experience whatsoever. I have done lots of different things. I was looking for a new challenge, and I was just kind of putting feelers out around my network. I got introduced to the scientists, and I got interested in the idea. And I think what got me excited were two things. Firstly, I knew nothing, so I was almost like an investor doing my own due diligence, except I knew a lot less than the average investor. And what I learned was, this is a problem worth solving. For me, with my background, which is not in sustainability, there's not that many things that cross your radar that are genuinely worth solving, worth getting out of bed to, the sort of thing my kids would get excited about. So that was one issue. The other issue is that the scale of both the challenge and the opportunity was huge. Fertilizer is almost a $200 billion market. It's a relatively homogenous product. Obviously, that's not 100% true. You have different crops in different countries, but you've got a massive, massive market that's ripe for disruption. And so the combination of those two things was, a really exciting challenge, and one thing led to another.
Yeah, no, it sounds like I didn't quite grasp the sort of scale of it, if I'm being frank with you. So I understand the appeal.
Yeah, the footprint's bigger than the whole of global aviation.
Wow.
So if you could eliminate the footprint of fertilizer, it would have more impact than grounding all the planes in the world.
Wow. It's amazing.
That's a statistic right there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was going to sort of say, you've raised in a difficult market. What do you think investors saw? But I think you've just answered that. Unless you think there's other things as well.
Well, in terms of raising, it has been a difficult market and still is, I think, pretty strong evidence for that. What do investors see? You'd have to ask them, really. Our lead investors have got a very heavy impact thesis. So they are looking for portfolio companies with the potential to have significant impact. And when I say impact, we're really talking about ultimately carbon impact or environmental impact. So I guess that's the big one. But then also, I think one of the things that is critical to the business model and is also very attractive things to investors is that the farmer pain point is not necessarily saving the world or the environment. The farmer pain point is financial. And so I think the problem with a lot of sustainable type solutions, things in that sustainability sector, is there is this green premium that you're going to do something good for the world, but you have to pay a bit more. That's all very well if you're really into it, but most people like the idea, but in reality are not really into it. And so, if you're a vegan, you might pay more for something that tastes a bit like a ribeye. If you're a steak eater, you're not going to pay more for something that doesn't even taste as good as a ribeye. And the same logic holds here. You can't ask people to pay more just for sustainability. You know, that it would have to be regulated, or the case would have to be absolutely overwhelming. In reality, you have to solve a customer's actual pain point, and the pain point is inevitably financial, and especially in the markets we're talking about. So, what I think one, coming looping back to your comment about investors, one really important point in terms of the viability of the business model is that there is an economic case independent of the environmental case. It's almost like we can match performance and do it cheaper for you. Oh, and by the way, it's better for the environment.
Yeah.
And so you've got a different value proposition, really, depending who you're talking to. Investors will place, or certainly our investors will place, a very high emphasis on the impact side of things. Farmers will place a very high emphasis on the price point.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a conversation earlier today doing another podcast, and very similar story where he said exactly that. People want to do good until they don't because of the price. And that's
Yeah.
the dichotomy, right?
I think one of the best examples of this is Amazon. Now, people talk a good story on how they want to do good for the world, and how they care about those things. Is Amazon a force for good? I'm not saying it's a force for bad, but it's not really a force for good. But the price point's amazing, the service experience is amazing, and we all use it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance, a bit of a gap between what people would like to think they believe and what they actually do.
Yeah. Yeah. Just everyone ignores the carbon footprint element of it because it's cheaper and it's easier.
Yeah, exactly.
Guilty as well, to be honest. And I appreciate you've not necessarily been in this space, for much of your career necessarily, but just do you have an opinion on whether sort of, climate funding and the environment today versus when you first started, or maybe earlier in your career, if you were exposed to it anyway, do you think it is vastly different now from the climate funding environment perspective?
It's a bit different. I think that where we started the bit, we founded the business in 21. We didn't really do anything meaningful till 22. I think we were just at the end there of a bit of a bull market for fundraising in sort of climate and ag and what have you. And people getting great valuations and great funding rounds, which there are some pros and cons to, because if you can't maintain that trajectory, that can hurt you down the line. So we just kind of missed that. We came in at the end of that, but it was still, climate was still a hot topic, 21 to 22. And it's less so now, that, driven by a whole range of factors. I think it started with some of the big funds saying this, not climate funds, but, your big sort of investment private equity players saying, actually, this is not helping us achieve ROI here. And, we're not really focusing on the things that make a difference to the business and getting investment returns. And then obviously there's some fairly obvious geopolitical factors. And so quite a lot of it's got a lower profile. It's not an attractive thing in its own right to the degree that it was. Some of it's just been rebadged, though. It doesn't really matter whether you call it climate or not. We've got some ongoing major problems with power grids, data, computing power, cooling, energy, all of these things. And so sustainable solutions for those things they're still the same things when they were badged as climate. They're just badged as something else now. And
Yeah.
I heard Shret from Gigascale talking about this recently, and he presented the same argument I've just said about the green discount. What they are looking for, and this is a big emergent fund in the US, what they're looking for is great outlier business models that, oh, by the way, happen to be sustainable as well. And so maybe it's a good thing in some ways that you can't raise money so easily now just by saying, oh, we're going to save the world, we're good for the climate. You're held to a higher bar, probably a good thing in terms of your underlying business model.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly that. Okay, so to kind of look at things in terms of what sort of changes after funding, what would you say, what pressures become real once that funding lands? Having gone through that experience yourself.
So it probably depends a bit how it lands. We've had 2 oversubscribed rounds that makes us sound like fundraising geniuses. The reality is they both went to the wire. And so the reason I say about it depends how it lands, if you had 3 competing term sheets and you closed with 6 months of runway left, you've got a lot of lead time to plan there. If you, like we did have 2 co-lead investors who are super credible and add a lot of value, but it did go to the wire in terms of closing it out. And so, just bit before your question is managing that bit, that we got to the last few months of runway. I was, at an increasingly high level of conviction that we'll close here, but it's not 100% guaranteed. And you walk this fine line between giving people a reason to stay and optimism. You don't want them to get nervous and hedge their bets and all leave, but you also need to be honest with them. you need to let them know that it's not 100% guaranteed, that, we are collectively carrying some risk here. And so that doesn't give you as much planning time as to how you're going to spend the money. It does in theory. You can have a budget that you present in all the investor decks and blah, blah, blah. But, to give you some practical examples, we were looking at moving laboratories. There's a limit to how far you can go down that road before the money's actually in the bank. Because you don't, when your runway's running out, you don't want to be paying lawyers and surveyors and contractual stuff. So it's almost like you can't even start that process until the money's in the bank. And that was true of quite a few things. Even with recruitment, you can sort of line people up a bit, but if you're recruiting into senior roles and there's a lead time on it, you can't really engage much in that process. And again, until the money's in the bank, you're 100% sure. So then you raise the money's in the bank, you go to the pub, and then after that, it's then, well, now what? And lots of things happen. You get this big number, which is just like, oh my God, look how many noughts there are in that. It's like, I mean, we had a bizarre one that we're with an internet bank, which has been very good for us for routine transactions. And it never crossed our mind that they wouldn't handle that number.
Really?
And so having run it to the wire and basically paid our last paychecks, we'd done our last pay run, the bank then couldn't take the money. And so we had to go back to the investors and say, no, all that money you promised to give us, so we can't handle it, which was quite embarrassing. A bit of a shout out there to HSBC Innovation Banking, actually. They stepped into the breach and set us up fast. We still had to do their due diligence, but they were very quick at managing that. So we had a bit of a last minute hurdle. And to come back to your question, so then you've got all this money in the bank. You've got all these things that you've theoretically planned, but haven't been able to move forward on them too quickly. And now you need to get them done. So suddenly you don't have any more staff on day one of the new round. There's a whole ton, all the business as usual stuff needs to carry on, but you've got some combination of CapEx, recruitment, everything else, all the things you wanted and need the money for, you have to start doing those as well as business as usual. And then what happened for us a little bit is you can get a little bit of tension, and this is in no way a reflection on the investors, just a reflection on reality. You get this tension between they want to see you delivering on your metrics and spending the money wisely and doing things and scaling up. But at the same time, over that sort of 6 months or so after the round, it became obvious that the fundraising environment's only going to get harder. Agriculture is quite a difficult area to raise. It's not sexy. It's below the radar. And you add the combination of those things up that, well, on the one hand, we want to spend that money wisely. We want to do all the things we said we're going to do. We want to hit the goalpost. On the other hand, you want to stretch that runway as long as you possibly can and really focus very hard. I think that's the sort of useful point to emphasize, that you get all this money and it's like, whoa, we can do all these different things. We can hire and we can do this and we can do that. Actually, what is most important to you is that, I'm looking at our specific example here. What we have to do is raise again at some point in the future. What's the most important thing that will help us raise again? For us, it's the data set, it's the results. What you want is to demonstrate commercial traction. The essential precursor to commercial traction is results. And in our field in particular, people want to see a wide breadth of results over multiple seasons and multiple locations. So you need to make sure you stay focused within that you've got all these things you could do. You've had all these amazing plans as you were planning, to do this round and raise all this money. But actually, you need to have absolute clarity in, okay, what is the next major milestone, the biggie at the next round, and then work back from that. What are the key milestones that we need to achieve between now and then? And you need to be really careful that you maintain a very clear focus on those things. And you stay true to the path. It'd be very easy to get dragged around a little bit. And then the other thing, I guess, is you have a new board, which is not a big drama. There's a negotiation during the round about who will get board seats, observers, how you're going to be structured. And that can be a bit of back and forth, but ultimately you sign up to that. But then that happens. And so you're building a new relationship with new investors. And I think, obviously, we've done a pre-seed and a seed, so it's not like we've got a Series B board, but the nature of your investors and the nature of the way it engage with the board is probably going to change as the growth from sort of seed to Series A and B and C and so on. So you're all finding your feet a little bit there in terms of what does that relationship look like? How do we manage that relationship most effectively? How do we get the most value out of these new advisors we've got effectively? And how do we make them feel as confident as we can about us without incurring, an unnecessarily reporting burden on our part? But we want them to be, we want to over deliver to them and make them feel good about it. So there's a whole bunch of things going on. I say that there's the bit beforehand. You can only do so much planning, and then you've got. I'm just kind of trying to summarize all the. I digressed a bit. Then when you get the money, you've got to deliver business as usual still and keep going. But then you've got all these other projects and things you're planning to spend the money on, and you've still got the same resources available to you. You've got to stay focused, and to stay focused, you have to have absolute clarity on what's the thing you're focusing on. And then, you've got this sort of new dynamic in between your C-suite and your board to manage as well.
Is that quite hard to? I mean, on the one hand, you're saying, okay, right, we've just raised, and now we've got to go and deliver against these objectives. But at the same time, you've got, as you've mentioned there, you've got the next raise in your mind as well. I guess, how do kind of investor expectations evolve after that first raise?
I don't know how their expectations necessarily evolve, but I think there's a very heavy onus on us to be aware of the next raise, which sounds obvious, but one of the things I said to the scientists a lot, I used to sort of push the same message again. We had this 1-page strategy, almost strategy in a page, and the bit in the middle was about the intent, the thing that we're trying to achieve. And the thing we're trying to achieve is to basically hit the right metrics for the next round. Now, the reason we get out of bed in the morning is not to raise money. That would be a bit soulless if that's your reason for living. However, the problem we're trying to solve would be very difficult to bootstrap or solve organically, grow organically. It would take us 20 years. The problem's massive. And so in order to have a meaningful impact on the problem we're trying to solve, we need to do it a lot faster than that. And in order to do it a lot faster than that, we need investor money. And we'll need investor money again after this. There'll be several rounds. And so there's always this slight tension, or there's a potential for slight tension between what you do with a blank sheet of paper, what science you do and what research and what activities to get you to the outcome that you want, versus what activities do you need to do to keep the investors happy?
Yeah.
Now, hopefully, those are going to be quite well aligned. We've all got skin in the same game. We should be naturally aligned to a reasonable degree. But there are things that we need to do internally that are actually quite important to us, maybe, that are not that sexy and don't really grab external or investor attention. There are other things that are very high on their radar, which we might have a slightly different opinion on the timeline or the relative importance right now. And that can be quite a tricky thing to balance. But ultimately, we have to do the right things for the next round. So I say, hopefully it's aligned what we want to do anyway and what will excite people about the next round. But if they're not quite aligned, or there's a bit of tension, we probably need to lean a little bit more to doing the right things for the next round, because that's the oxygen that will keep the business going. It's not our reason for living, but with no oxygen, we don't live anyway. I'm not sure I answered your question there. I just went off on some random tangent.
No, not at all. You did. I imagine that is quite hard operationally as the business grows, because you've got all these sort of different departments that have, yes, you're on the same team, you kind of, bring them all on along the same mission and the same vision, but equally, scientists might want to go out and explore really cool new concepts and spend a little R&D budget, and sales are out there saying, offering bespoke solutions to every customer they speak to.
Yeah.
You've got to kind of balance all of those things and bring that all together. So no small feat operationally as the business starts to grow, and balancing that against investor expectations.
I mean, that hasn't been a major problem for us in some ways, in that we're still quite small. The chief scientist understands the tension between the science, the commercial, and the investor pressures.
That's good.
And so he gets the fact, he totally understands that we can't pursue perfection and we can't pursue sort of intellectual purity necessarily, because it would take 20 years and we'd be out of runway.
Yeah.
And so we have reasonably, I think, we've had good internal alignment on that. But even though we're small, we are starting to get to more of that cross-functional sort of working or requirement that you just described. So up to now, we've effectively been an R&D company with a couple of other people who do commercial stuff and run the business. But even now, we've already moved from being R&D output. That is our output. Now we run field trials, and we're running trials with distributors. And so now you start to get these feedback loops between R&D, our own field trials, and what the market might want as well. And so then that has to feed back. The R&D can no longer pursue the path that it thinks is right in isolation. You've got these various feedback loops with what we're seeing in our own trials and what feedback, even at its early stage, we're getting from the market. So you do have to, quite quickly shift to a cross-functional model that requires more time spent on collaboration and communication. And yeah, people who've spent most of their life doing pure R&D in a lab, that's not maybe the natural default, but that is an essential thing for the growth of the business.
Yeah. And looking back, sort of what part of scaling did you as a founder maybe underestimate?
Everything is at least as difficult as it can be,
Right.
if that makes any sense.
It does, yeah.
That all the little things are time consuming. They take more time, effort, and resource than you might imagine. Everything just needs a bit more time, effort, resource that you don't have. So you're constantly, when you say, did you underestimate? I don't know, I'm not a young founder. So I'd done other things. I'd worked in a high pressure environment. So it wasn't like it was a sort of huge light coming on moment for me. But I guess even so, I underestimated it. Our cornerstone investor, when we first started, I was just working part time, and she was like, "Oh, no, 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 no." And I'm saying, "Well, we're just doing R&D. What is there for me to do?" And yeah, there was plenty for me to do. So there's always tons to do. You never have enough time, money, or resources available to you.
Yeah.
So it's just that really that. But it comes down to that focus issue again and prioritization.
It's interesting you
Well,
talk about there, like, not your first rodeo, but equally you can have all the answers, you can have given advice on all the answers in the past, made all the mistakes, but somehow when you're doing it, from the inside, we've had this conversation with many people, you still just make those same mistakes, even though you've sat there and given the exact advice to people before and gone through that path. But I don't know whether it's history repeating itself or whatever it is, but just when you're in that moment, I think you used the phrase, Alex, head down and windmilling. It's it's hard to see the wood from the tree sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, when you're in it, it is tough. I think one of the things that when we're talking to founders, one thing that I think is, it's not necessarily even on their radar, let alone underestimating, is, that transition point where maybe they go from CEO to chair, which obviously you have recently announced, which I think is an amazing thing to be able to see is when you're in it like that. What is it that drove that decision? Because I feel you've done that quite early on, and obviously it was the right thing to do for the business, because otherwise you wouldn't have done it. But what sort of drove that?
Yeah, you're right. It probably have done it unusually. I got involved with this for the reasons I said. It seemed like a good idea. It was a problem worth solving, big opportunity. I'm not being sort of falsely modest to say I had no relevant experience. I had a lot of experience at getting shit done. And so that obviously is pretty important. And I'd like to think I'm a good thinker, a good organizer. But I didn't know the domain in any great depth at all. I didn't know the domain. Period. And that wasn't really a major issue on day one. The chief scientist knows it. And on day one, the first investors are really investing in, do we think this is a good idea? And do we think these people might pull it off or make significant progress? They're not really getting into micro detail into how you're going to do it. Obviously, they're going to look at some projections and what have you, but it's a pretty high risk bet on, is it a good idea, and the team. And then that's true to a lesser extent in the seed round. And of course, I've got to the stage where I can hold my own on the science quite comfortably. Not like a PhD biologist could, but for a if I'm talking to a non-expert, I can hold my own quite comfortably, and I can have an entry-level conversation with an expert. And, I'm well aware of the limits on my own circle of competence and knowing when to stop or I don't know, but I can hold my own. It sort of became obvious we're solving a few big challenges all in one go. One is a pure technical challenge. Can we produce that data set that shows consistency? Or one of my co-founders loves this phrase about a reliable, robust product. That's the big challenge with biologicals. Can you produce a reliable, robust product? So that is primarily a technical challenge for the scientists. Then we have this other one about market entry. We're currently focused on Asia for lots of reasons to do with crops in Asia, and there's a particularly good fit for us there. And so you're talking about this small British startup entering Asian markets, and not just sort of randomly, not like an e-commerce business or something. We're entering some quite niche markets about agriculture, farmers, distribution in agriculture, growing the commercialization of R&D in agriculture. And as time went on, it became clear to me that, would I have backed myself to pull that up and taken the business further? Yeah, I'm naively wedded to my own brilliance. But Might it suit somebody else better? And that was fairly obvious to me that that might well be the case. And I'd mentioned it to our first investor quite early on. And she said, look, I get that. She said, I would, stay the course for a while and, see how things play out. But then after we closed this last round, I thought, and I took some advice from somebody else about if you were a founder, if you're in this situation, what's the best way to handle it? And their advice was to wait a few months after the round. You don't really want to say on day two, by the way, can I leave, please? So wait a few months after the round, get things settled down, get organized, get on top of everything. But actually, that's a good time then, because what you want to do is recruit somebody. That's going to take X months. And then that person needs a meaningful run at the next round. They need to be in post for 6 months, a year beforehand. And so, that was the logic. It wasn't that hard for me. I say it wasn't. I might have seen it differently, I suppose, if the whole thing had originally been my idea
Yeah.
and it was my passion in a deeper way. That's not to say I wasn't sort of wholly committed and excited and working hard around the opportunity, but I could also take quite an objective view on it that, what they say, one of the things about leadership is surround yourself with people better than you. Well, that's what I would always aim to do. But in particular, can you hand the organization on in good shape?
Mm.
And you're right. It was early, but it was a rational decision. And because of that timeline I described, it was either now or wait another 2 to 3 years for the next round.
Mm.
And so it's not like a continuous window. I think the windows are probably 6 months block at the start of a round.
Yeah.
So that was the logic. And I say it wasn't too hard for me to get my head around that. It's interesting. One of the concerns the investors had, they were initially a bit like shocked and they didn't want me to go. And then obviously we headed down this route. One of the concerns they had about moving to chair was it would be very difficult for a new CEO to come in with an ex-founder chair who was all over it and had the fingers and everything. But because for me this was a sort of rational choice, I was okay with, I now need to adopt a different set of behaviors in order to be the chair. And I do need to step back. I do need to bring in somebody who's very competent, who can do it. They're going to take X amount of time to get up to speed. But then I need to step back and, my role is fundamentally different now. And it's still a bit of a transition at the moment, but the future role is fundamentally different. I was okay with that and doing what was required for that new role.
Yeah, absolutely. My next question was going to be founders we've spoken to that have done this. They do find it difficult to separate the identity of that role into the new role, but it sounds like you're taking it very much in your stride. Have you done it before or?
No, and you'd have to ask somebody else if I'm taking it in my stride. But I think my relationship with the new CEO is very good. I'm very confident he would say that. And I took some advice. Like I say, I'm not 21, so I've got some friends who've done some big gigs, and chair of private equity companies and the like. And so, even though this is a much smaller scale operation, I took some advice from them on, and one guy in particular who'd made that transition at a big PLC about what's the difference, what do you perceive as the roles. I often think there's good lessons for small businesses from big business. You don't want all the bureaucracy of big business because that's why people don't want to be a big business.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be weighed down with all that. But equally, one of the challenges of small businesses is that a lot of things are less defined, especially with founders. You've got this very ambiguous sort of relationships all across with each other between, at the same time, your founders, your managers, and there's some sort of line management hierarchy-ish. If somebody's supposed to be the CEO, your shareholders, you might be directors. So you've got all these messy relationships. And so I often think it's a useful example to think, well, what would this look like in a big company? And I think that's true of the chair role. Even though this is very small, informal, flexible, we can mold it as we see fit. I did take some advice from people who've done bigger jobs about, how would you handle this? What does it look like in your world?
Yeah, that's interesting. That as well. Do you feel that founders who are CEOs can quite often stay in the role too long simply because they built the company? There's that sort of romantic side of it almost.
Yes, I don't think I'm a bit worried about committing too hard on that, but I think there's pretty overwhelming evidence that you see as companies get to sort of Series A, Series B, investors come on who recognize that this requires a different level of management and a different level of experience. And so you quite often see founders at that time sidelined into some job that sounds really good and sounds really important, but isn't. And so maybe I saved myself by yeah. I know a football manager who left at the end of his contract recently, who and I said, "Why are you leaving?" And he said, "If you stay in this job long enough, you'll get sacked. It's better to leave on your terms." Now that was not my logic at all, but it might
Makes
still
sense.
apply. That so you do so because I think I've done quite a lot of consulting work, and if you look at what skill set do you need in your best ever exec? So you need direction setting. That's an intellectual activity, really. It's kind of IQ, the ability to articulate in a complicated environment, articulate and communicate. Sorry, to set and communicate very clear directions. It's an intellectual activity. Then you need management, getting stuff done. That's like a physical activity, maybe not like going to the gym, but stuff happens. And then you need leadership, which, in its purest form is bringing other people on the journey with you. That's a moral and emotional activity.
Mm.
There's not many people in any context, whether it's startups, entrepreneurs, or big corporate, who have all three of those. So the ones that you see that last the course are, I guess, the obvious examples of your big tech companies who actually start the company and end up as the CEO of a big listed company, and they're still in post as a very effective, incredible CEO. That's a really small number.
Yeah.
Not many people have enough of those skills. And actually, even of those, we can digress again, but you know, some of the personal leadership skills they're different to what if you had a blank sheet of paper and say, what does a good leader look like? There might not be those things, but you can't take away they're very successful. So
Mm.
yeah, I think coming back to your point, there aren't many founders who would have the skill set and competency and the ability to develop themselves and the growth mindset to be a startup founder and still be the CEO at IPO.
Very true. Over to you, Will.
Yeah. So looking at sort of building teams and building teams that investors trust as well, did you find or do you find that the bar changes for hiring after funding?
Yes, of course it does. So you only want 10s on your team, but you can't afford 10s. And that's not to take anything away from the people in the business. We've got a wonderful team and they've worked hard and we've raised money on the back of the results they produced. I'm just the person who shows off and does this sort of stuff and spouts about it all, and I'm vaguely articulate apparently. Whereas it's those people who've raised the money because they've done all the work. But of course, the ex sort of super experienced corporate person who's earning 150 or 200K is probably not going to come on board on day one, no matter how much equity you give them. Or you're going to have to give them, they're either going to have to really believe it takes so much risk, and you're going to have to give them more than you're ever going to want to give away. So of course it changes that your ability to bring in people who are playing at the level you want with the level of competency and also the experience increases when you've got more money in the bank, and so your hiring policy evolves a bit. So I think we've got a very strong team, particularly around the science. I hope those people stay for the very long time, hopefully forever. But as you add to it, you're adding a slightly different type of experience sometimes. You still bring in new people at the sort of lower end of, or the earlier stages in their career, the lower end of the experience set. But at the mid to senior roles, you're now able to attract people through a combination of money and options that you wouldn't have been able to attract on day one.
Yeah, very true. So, I mean, that's one part of the puzzle. You have that, you've got deeper pockets than you used to have. What else makes kind of attracting experienced talent difficult in specialist climate sectors?
Well, equity is part of it. Inevitably, even coming on a bit further down the road, it's probably not till Series B or beyond that you're really taking on people at senior level with no salary sacrifice compared to what they've got elsewhere. So the equity options story is often an important part of it. So I think it's easy for founders. It's the same is true when you have a negotiation with investors, but also with new hires, it's easy for founders to, want to keep hold of everything and give away as little as possible. You have to be able to share the spoils a bit. So that makes a big difference, I think. I mean, you'd be better off asking our new CEO this, I think, in some ways, about what convinced him to take the risk and why did he come on board. And you've got to have, in the same way as an investor's looking at it, you've got to have a credible story, a path to commercialization that looks credible to them. Yeah, it's a little bit difficult for me to answer that from my side of the fence, to be honest.
No, sure, I appreciate that. To touch on that storytelling piece, you talked about the equity story and other aspects to it. How important do you think storytelling and kind of vision is when when hiring into niche markets, but also just when scaling a business in the early stages?
Yeah, it's critical for lots of reasons. You have to be able to, you are selling something new in some context. You may or may not be genuinely breaking new ground that nobody's ever done before, but you're selling a new business, a new concept. You have to be able to articulate that clearly and simply in ways that people who are not experts understand easily. And I think, we start from a great position of advantage on that. The fertilizer story is easy to explain. Essential for food security, bad for the world, use less, save the farmers money, less environmental stuff. If you've got some complex product for less carbon in new buildings or something, that's more difficult to explain. But it doesn't matter what the thing is you're doing, you have to be able to explain it clearly and simply. And then you have to be able to bring people on the journey with you. It's not just a case of explaining it, you have to be able to lay it out in a way that there's this huge thing at the end of the rainbow, and I can explain that very clearly and simply, and you get it, and you get why it's important, and you get why we're going for it. And now explain how we're going to get there without requiring, a 200-page McKinsey deck. And so you need to be able to communicate that in a very clear way that is also engaging with, passion passion would be great, but I don't think not everybody is naturally super passionate and brilliant at being passionate and displaying that. But you have to be able to convince people that you are better placed than anybody else in the world to solve this problem right now. So, you have to be able to explain what the problem is, how you're going to get there, and then convince them that it's you. And so, it comes over in so many ways, different types of communication. When you're applying for grants, answer the question. You have to be able to answer the questions very specifically. I don't know how I'm doing on this interview. I'm digressing a bit, but I do tend to answer the question. I'll come back and make sure I've answered it. You have to be able to do that in your written communications, in your verbal communications. You have to be able to, when you're recruiting and interviewing people, give them something to hang on to. The same with investors, the same when you're doing this sort of stuff or external communication. So I think it's a really important part of the whole mix to be able to articulate this stuff clearly and with energy and passion in a way that people get.
So I think it'd be interesting to talk about the commercialization of the technology. So what's harder in your opinion? Is it building the technology, or is it the commercialization of it?
I think it depends what you mean by building. There's a kind of value chain here from I'm talking about our business, agriculture, from laboratory R&D to product in the field to commercialization, and each of those stages pose its own challenge. You can have brilliant R&D and produce amazing results in the lab, and this is very common with biologicals, that basically doesn't work that well in the field. And then you could have something that works really well in the field, and you've actually got this to work and you've proven it, and it's not the right thing at the right time with the right positioning for farmers or whoever your customer is. So I think each of those stages is pivotal. The clever bit is not necessarily doing R&D or doing field trials or doing commercialization. It's joining them all up. It's getting those things to all be aligned and coherent, such that at the end of it, it's almost like in the military, they have this sort of analogy about the pointy end of the spear. There's a bit that delivers, but all the other bits you need to be perfectly aligned behind that to allow the bit that delivers to work. So I don't know if one is probably in different contexts or different businesses or different products that there might be one of those things in the value chain might be harder to solve. I think for us, I'm not sure any one of them is obviously easier or harder. They all pose their own challenges, but the science is the foundation on which everything else is built. If the science and the basic concept isn't rock solid, the rest of it's a waste of time. So the way I tend to think of it is the science is binary. That has to be good and it has to work. And so until you've got that right, that's the only thing. But at the point that you've got that right, then it just becomes one of the work streams, and they all need to sort of join together, to get to the pointed end of the spear at the same time.
Yeah, I think when we're having all these conversations with founders, they're all doing something different, and it's that adoption piece. So, from your perspective, how do you convince markets to adopt something fundamentally different?
Well, one thing is not to be too fundamentally different. Your underlying science or the thing that got you there might be fundamentally different, but if you're asking end users to adopt something fundamentally different, you're making your life really hard for yourself. So one of the reasons we're focused on the markets is we have an application methodology which is not fundamentally different as the farmer perceives it. The science that's going on is really, really different, but what the farmer sees is not different. So I think the less change you could ask of your end user, that's really important. And the other one, we touched on it already, you need to solve their pain point. You could we're doing a lot with rice at the moment. You could go to Asia and say, hey, we come from England and we know how to do rice better, blah, 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 and we're going to make it more sustainable. Farmers don't care. In Indonesia, one of the biggest problems with rice is you lose the crop, a load of the crop to rats. And so that's the farmer's pain point. In Vietnam, it's liquidity. It's not just profit or money, it's liquidity. It's paying for things at the point before when you buy them, before the harvest. And so the problem they're trying to solve there is not how do we make more profit, it's like, how do I not be in debt while the crop is growing? So you have to align this thing where you think you're being so clever and you've got this game-changing product. Does it actually solve a pain point that is relevant to and interesting to customers? And so that the primary pain point we're interested in is liquidity, and so it's going to be cheaper. And so if you can't do it cheaper, your adoption problem is going to be way harder. So to ask them to do something new, even with only a little bit of behavioral change, and you've got to bear in mind they're taking risks. And so to ask them to do something new and take risk and change a bit, and it's not even cheaper, you've got no chance.
Yeah.
And so risk is the other one in that mix. That if you're dealing with a farmer in America who's got 10,000 hectares and you go, hey, we've got this fancy new product, they might be, okay, sounds interesting, and try with half a hectare. I'll be interested to see how you get on. If you're dealing with a farmer that's got 1.5 hectares, they are going to be very, very nervous about the potential for failure, losing the crop. So, you have to be very confident it's going to work, but you have to somehow underwrite that risk for them. So you have to demonstrate. I've stood in paddy fields and asked farmers, would you use this product? And invariably what they say is, if we see it works and it is cheaper, they will be interested. So It's got to be cheaper. And when they see it works, they literally mean see it. So they want to see it with their own eyes.
Yeah.
So what do you need to do? You need to ask the least change of them possible. You need to solve their real pain point, and you need to show them that it works and not ask them to take too much risk with it.
Yeah. I really, really like that. Not actually different for the end user. Everything behind it, completely different, but the end user, I think that's a great observation. And also, do you think that whilst it needs to work, they're also looking for, I don't know, a X increase on efficiency or whatever it might be? Or do you actually think they're happy with, it works the same, it's a bit cheaper, I'll go with it?
I think if you could offer 10x and guarantee it, then obviously they'd be interested in that and they would like it. But nobody's going to be doing that, not in the foreseeable future. And farmers have had lots of snake oil salesmen telling them all sorts of stories and rubbish for many years. And so they're highly skeptical and they're very risk averse. So of course it would be better to offer them 10x. But I think in reality, you've just got to make a hole in their current problem, let them see it, and then when you've solved the current problem, and then they say, oh, actually, I'm getting a better yield and better returns, and this is all great, brilliant. But I think just promising them that on day one, it just sounds like an empty promise.
She will.
Excellent. So I always like to ask people this question, and also you've given some really, really good insights and good points.
You're making me nervous now, because I have a question I always ask at the end of interviews, and it's unfeasibly difficult because I like to see people under a bit of pressure.
Oh, this is good. Maybe the first time for that. So my question to you is, what advice would you give any kind of first-time founders after raising, having lived through that, from your experience?
It would be a combination of the things we've spoken about. I think the more you can be ready to go, the better. And as I say, it's quite difficult to be, because there are some things that are quite difficult to progress as far as you would like until the money's in the bank. So there's this sort of fine line of tension between getting them as far as you can, such that you can move quickly, having absolute clarity of what you're going to do with the money, and being as ready as possible so that you can move quickly, but not overcommitting yourself before the money is in the bank. So that would be quite a key thing. I guess the relationship with the new board could be pivotal. It could be super easy, but you just don't quite know how that's going to play out. So invest time in getting to know your new board. And that's not just a superficial, like, go and have a beer or something. What are their drivers? What do they want and need to see? What stage is their fund at? Are they about to start harvesting, or are they just started deploying? They will have some different drivers and motivations and incentives. Yeah, I don't know. Be positive. Take over the world.
A good point about their fund's life cycle, whether they're in kind of origination or if they're fundraising, where they're at in their life cycle of their fund.
Yeah, that relationship's really quite important. it's a bit like the whole concept of fundraising. It's not the reason we get out of bed, but it's a pivotal part of how well the business runs. And are the expectations aligned on metrics and priorities? Because if they are, and you're delivering on them, they will start to get confident in you, and your life will be fairly stress-free. If they've got fundamentally different priorities in mind, or you're not delivering on the things they think are important, and you didn't realize that, then they'll start putting their oar in more. You'll spend more time on that stuff. Life just becomes a bit less fun.
You're in for a rocky ride, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it won't work, but it'll be less fun, less efficient.
Yeah,
But they'll be keeping a closer eye on you.
no, you're absolutely right. And what would you do differently if you were starting again? Can't say nothing.
I'm not sure I do big fundamental things differently. It's kind of, we're not in a bad place. It's all kind of worked. We've raised some money. We've transitioned. We've got a new CEO. Lots of things have gone quite well, and the business is usually going quite well. But what have I learned that we could have done differently, or in hindsight? I think one thing is that the relationship between founders can be quite ambiguous and not brilliantly defined, because you're founders. So you're in it together as a team. But actually, what you end up as is people with line responsibilities as shareholders and possibly as directors. And they're all different roles. And the line responsibilities is a particularly interesting one, that if one of the founders is going to be the CEO, what does that mean to the other founders in terms of decision-making rights? So a couple of the things that we've done that helped, but it was never perfect. And this issue about decision-making rights, does another founder report to the CEO as a report? There's no right answer to that, but it's useful to get to an answer. So there's no definitively right answer, but how do we understand that relationship? And are we all aligned on our understanding? So a couple of things we wrote our own terms of reference, so that we actually wrote down, we did it in quite a structured way, that we did have a sort of nice little template for it, so that we wrote down and then we cross-referred, and we're all happy with, this is my responsibilities, this is how my freedoms, my constraints, all the rest of it. We also did one of these RASI documents, this sort of responsible, accountable, consulted in, which sounds a bit like corporate BS, but actually it's super important. And I don't think the output is the important thing, it's the doing it, because it forces you to have a conversation about who's responsible for what, who's got decision-making autonomy on what, and what things do I need to refer to somebody else or come to a collective decision. So I think time invested in that stuff early on. I've described a couple of things we did, and it makes it sound like we're really well organized on it. We kind of did those down the line a bit, not to fix problems, but to clear up things that were ambiguous. And it was never perfect. I think time invested in that relationship building, task clarity, role clarity, we were probably a bit light on that. And I think that would be a really good thing to do.
Yeah, one of the things we did in my last business is the four sort of main people. We had a thing called 1 meter squared. We did exactly what you just said, but it was fantastic because you could be in a board meeting and someone would talk about something they're doing, and you're like, "Hang on a minute, that sounds like you're in my 1 meter squared. So get out," But it was jovial. It was fun banter rather than getting annoyed about it. Like people, I think that's the other thing with a startup environment. People are doing stuff because they want to. They're trying to help. They're mission driven. Is nothing.
100%.
Nothing malicious. They're just trying to do you a bit of a favor, but you do need that very strict, well, this is what I'm owning. I won't tread in yours. You don't tread in mine, because that's efficient as well, right?
Yeah. They can be acting with the best of intentions, but it can actually introduce disharmony, even with the best of intentions. It can annoy you, piss you off. And then, like you say, it can also be inefficient. You'll then get duplication of effort or inefficiencies creeping in.
Totally.
So even though it seems a bit formulaic, I think time spent on that stuff is really time well spent.
Agree. Well, look, I think, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. But look, I think this has been a fantastic discussion. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to seeing what you get up to in the next sort of few months as well.
Cool. Thank you very much.